She slapped me, in front of my husband, in front of the neighbors. She spat the word slut like it was truth carved in stone, and my husband David just stood there saying nothing. Eyes lowered. I had cooked, cleaned, served, and smiled for that woman for 8 years. I endured her insults, her sabotage, even her schemes to get David back with his ex. I swallowed every cruel word because I loved him, because I thought family mattered. But at that moment, something inside me broke. I refused to be trampled on any longer. What they don't know is, my father is the reclusive billionaire Robert Whitmore of Connecticut, and I'm done hiding. I had just finished setting the final dish down on the long oak table when it happened. Her hand came out of nowhere. No warning, no hesitation. Just the sharp, blistering sound of skin meeting skin, the sting blooming across my cheek like fire under glass. The room fell silent. Forks hovered midair. Someone's child stopped laughing. The clatter of a wine glass tipping over was the only sound after the slap. And then she said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You filthy little slut. You think dressing up like that will make you anything more than the nobody you are." The air left my lungs. I didn't respond. Couldn't. My eyes flicked toward David. My husband, his mouth was open slightly, his hands resting motionless on his thighs, and worst of all, his eyes were lowered. He didn't defend me. He didn't say my name. He didn't say anything. And in that moment, I realized I was alone. Again, I had spent years trying to win this woman's approval. Evelyn Bennett David's mother was the kind of person who smiled sweetly in front of guests and stabbed you in the back as soon as they left. I used to think if I cooked the perfect dinner, if I kept the house spotless, if I wore neutral colors and spoke gently, maybe she'd accept me. Maybe she'd see me not as the outsider, the poor girl with no pedigree, but as her daughter-in-law, as family. But she never saw me that way. From the day I met her, I was a problem to solve, an obstacle to overcome. She never liked that David married me quickly, never liked that I wasn't from their circles, never liked that I didn't care for gossip or yacht parties or whatever validation she chased behind the tinted windows of her life. The slap was a release. For her, maybe. But for me, it was a breaking point. Not just for my pride, but for my years of silence. For all the times I looked the other way when she mocked my cooking or joked about my background in front of her friends. For all the whispered comments about my clothes being off the rack. For the Christmas when she gifted me an apron and a cookbook titled How to Be a Proper Wife. And David? He just stood there, just like he had stood there every time she insulted me, smiling weakly, pretending not to hear, making excuses, whispering, "She's just old-fashioned wit. Don't take it personally." But now my ears were ringing from more than her slap. Now I saw it all clearly. I refused to be trampled on any longer. I was done shrinking, done apologizing, done proving myself to people who had already decided I was beneath them. I turned to her, my face burning, but my voice low and calm. "That was your last mistake, Evelyn." She blinked. Maybe surprised I didn't cry. Maybe surprised I was still standing. Maybe deep down afraid. Because she didn't know who I was. Not really. To her, I was Whitney Green. A girl from Connecticut with no parents to speak of who married her son after a whirlwind 6-month romance and never asked for anything. A woman who worked 2 jobs before she lucked out and got David to propose. She didn't know the rest. She never cared to. She didn't know that my full name was Whitney Whitmore Green, that I was the only daughter of Robert Whitmore, a man she read about in Forbes but had never met. She didn't know that I had walked away from that world on purpose, choosing love and normalcy over limousines and headlines. But maybe it was time she learned, not because I needed her approval, but because I wanted her to remember this moment The slap, the insult, the silence of her son, and understand that she had struck the wrong woman. My heart thudded against my ribs as I looked around the table. The neighbors avoided eye contact. David stared at his wine glass like it held all the answers. My hands were steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't playing peacekeeper. I wasn't holding back tears or swallowing anger. I was free. The night dragged on. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I cleared the plates like a ghost, watching the people I had tried so hard to please eat the food I made like nothing had happened. Like I didn't just get slapped in front of them. Like Evelyn hadn't just called me a slut in front of my husband. But I wasn't invisible anymore. I was a storm building in silence. And storms never announce themselves with screaming. They roll in quiet until lightning strikes. That night after the guests left and David followed me into the kitchen with some limp excuse about how awkward things had gotten, I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked him one question. Did you like watching her hit me? His eyes widened, shocked, indignant. What, no, Whitney, of course not. Then why didn't you stop her? I asked. He didn't answer. I nodded. I'm staying with a friend tonight, I said. Wait. But I was already walking out. The cold air slapped me harder than she ever could. But it felt better. Cleaner. Because this time I knew what I was walking toward. Not just away from abuse, but toward something no one in that house had ever seen in me. Power. And I was finally ready to use it. Looking back, I realize now silence had become my second skin. I wore it every day like armor. I smiled when I was insulted, nodded when I was dismissed, and bit my tongue so many times that it practically scarred. But back then I thought it was love. I thought loyalty meant swallowing pain if it kept the peace. I thought that if I gave everything eventually, they'd see me, appreciate me, accept me. They never did. I met David when I was 24 and still healing from my mother's sudden death. I had just left my graduate program to help sort through her estate. In the middle of that fog of grief, David came into my life like a warm fire. Handsome, most charming, he made me feel like someone wanted me. I wasn't drifting alone anymore. He proposed after 6 months. His mother never liked me. From the first brunch, she referred to me as that girl. When she found out I didn't finish my master's, she asked loudly if I'd be working retail forever. At our engagement party, she brought David's ex, Tiffany, and introduced her to guests as the one who should have been. Instead, I said nothing. I convinced myself it was just nerves. That Evelyn would come around. But she didn't come around. She came closer like a hunter to a wounded animal. And I let her, because I loved David, because I thought he loved me enough to stand up for me. I told myself all marriages required sacrifice, so I made them. I sold the small townhouse I inherited from my mom and used every penny to help pay off David's debt. I gave up a fellowship opportunity in Boston because Evelyn insisted wives stay close. I cooked, cleaned, budgeted through dinner parties, ironed shirts, and even learned her favorite recipes just to impress her. Every day I chipped away at my own ambitions, my identity, my peace. I once overheard Evelyn telling David she should be grateful. Without you, she's nothing. He didn't correct her. I asked him later, "Do you believe that?" He laughed. "She's just being dramatic." That's when I learned something ugly. David didn't think I was nothing, but he didn't think I was something either. I was a convenience, a reliable presence, someone to take care of him and tolerate his family while he played the exhausted husband. I stayed quiet. I cooked his meals. I memorized his favorite morning coffee routine. I planned birthdays, anniversaries, even Evelyn's own surprise retirement party, complete with a video montage, and her old sorority sisters flown in from Florida. She never said thank you. Instead, she asked why I wore such a cheap dress for the occasion, and I stayed quiet. I became the woman who made things work, the one who held it all together while being picked apart behind closed doors. One Christmas, she gave me a gift wrapped in red satin paper. Everyone watched as I unwrapped it. Inside was a book, How to Be More Likeable. She smiled. The room laughed. So I laughed too, through my teeth with my face frozen. David later said, "You know she didn't mean it. That's just her sense of humor. But the thing is, humor shouldn't leave bruises. And bruises don't always show on skin. Some stay under the surface invisible, but heavy. Like the ache I carried every night when I climbed into bed beside a man who never noticed how small I was becoming. There were good days, sure. I don't deny that. Days when David was soft and sweet, when we'd dance barefoot in the kitchen when I thought this is worth it. But those days became fewer and farther between, and the apologies that followed the insults started sounding like reruns of a bad movie. You're overthinking it. She didn't mean anything by it. Just be the bigger person. But what happens when being the bigger person makes you feel smaller every time? I began to disappear. The girl who once dreamed of opening her own publishing house, who loved poetry and vintage bookstores and late-night drives by the coast, that girl was buried under laundry piles and grocery lists and Evelyn's endless expectations. Still, I thought if I held on a little longer, something would change. That maybe Evelyn would wake up one day and say, "You're good enough." But she never did. And David? He never asked how I was doing. Never noticed how I stopped singing while I cooked, or how I flinched every time Evelyn entered the room. I told myself to wait until things got better, but better never came. And then came that night the slap. It didn't just sting my face. It shattered the illusion I had wrapped myself in for years, that if I gave enough, endured enough, loved enough, they would see me as worthy. No more. I remember packing a single bag that night. Just the essentials. My passport, a plain black notebook, and one letter from my father. A letter I hadn't looked at in 5 years. The one where he begged me to come home. Where he said, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You were born enough." I hadn't spoken to him since I chose to leave the Whitmore name behind. But maybe it was time, not to be rescued, but to remember who I was before they told me I was nothing. Before I let them strip me down. Before I gave my light away. That night I made a promise. I would no longer sacrifice myself to people who wouldn't bleed a drop for me. I would no longer suffer in silence for the comfort of those who saw my silence as permission. I would no longer be small. And if that meant burning bridges to build better roads, so be it. Most people only ever knew me as Whitney Green. That was the name I carried through David's world, the name on the mailbox, on the PTA committee, on the dinner place cards, at Evelyn's fundraisers. It was simple, unthreatening, easy to digest. No grand expectations, no pressure, no past. But that wasn't my full name, not the one I was born with. The truth is, my full name is Whitney Whitmore Green, daughter of Robert Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Capital, and one of the most private billionaires in the country. A man so reclusive he hadn't spoken publicly in a decade, but whose fingerprints are etched across every major development in New York, Boston, and even parts of London. People only spoke his name in whispers, as if he were part myth, part tycoon. And I had chosen to leave that world behind, because it wasn't glamorous, not to me. It was cold and transactional. Lonely dinners, glass towers, bodyguards, and headlines that never matched reality. My mother hated it. She used to call it gold-plated isolation. When she died, I had a choice: carry on the family name or start over. I chose the latter. When I met David, I told him I was from a quiet family in Connecticut. Technically, it wasn't a lie. I just left out the part about the private estate with the iron gates, the trust fund I had frozen, and the family office that still sent quarterly letters asking if I wanted to resume my seat on the board. I wanted a life where love wasn't measured by bank statements or inheritance. But in trying to find something real, I let myself become disposable. After that slap, after that dinner, after the years of being whittled down, I went home. Not to our house, not to David. I went home. To Connecticut. To Stonecrest. That's what we called the estate, my father's compound overlooking the Long Island Sound. When I walked through the iron gates, the guards recognized me immediately. They didn't ask questions. They just opened the doors. Miss Whitney, one of them, nodded gently. Your father's in the observatory. He'll be glad you came. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. He didn't even hesitate when he saw me. He just stood up from his leather chair, crossed the marble floor, and pulled me into a long, tight hug. I was wondering how long you'd let them treat you like that, he whispered. I sobbed. Not because I was sad, but because someone had seen me, really seen me for the first time in years. He didn't say I told you so. He didn't gloat. He just sat me down and said, let's remind you who you are. We talked for hours. I told him everything, Evelyn, the insults, the emotional neglect, the sacrifices. I told him about the slap. I told him David stood there and did nothing. My father listened, quiet, focused. His blue eyes still sharp as ever, never left mine. You've always been stronger than them, Whitney, he said. You just forgot for a while. The next morning I made a decision. It was time to reclaim my name. I contacted the family attorney and asked him to unlock my trust. I didn't need all of it, just a portion to set things in motion. I requested updated access to the Whitmore Holdings board. I had a seat there even if I'd never used it. That was about to change. I wasn't going to fight them the way they expected. No screaming, no confrontations, just silence and undeniable power. I booked a suite at the Four Seasons under my full name, Whitney Whitmore Green. I scheduled meetings. I hired a new stylist, someone discreet but gifted. I began to rebuild not the old me but the real me. A woman who didn't need to explain herself to people who couldn't see her worth. And the best part? They had no idea. David thought I was crashing at a friend's. Evelyn probably imagined I was begging him to let me back in. In their minds, I was still the small-town girl who didn't belong. They didn't know I was sitting on an inheritance worth over $300 million. They didn't know the same girl they slapped, insulted, and humiliated was one of the largest stakeholders in the development company Evelyn's charity relied on for their next gala venue. The irony, the venue she was bragging about, the brand new event center that was too exclusive for regular donors, it was mine. I had just acquired the property through a shell investment firm the week before, and I had already given instructions to the new management team. No bookings approved under the Bennett Foundation, not without my signature. The phone call from Evelyn came 2 days later. Her voice was shrill, panicked. Whitney, darling, you wouldn't happen to know someone at Whitmore Estates, would you? They're refusing to confirm our booking and said it's under review by one of their senior stakeholders. I smiled. Oh, that's strange, I said smoothly. Maybe I'll look into it. You'd be doing us a big favor. This gala is extremely important to our public relations and investor confidence. I'm sure you understand. I hung up after that. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to strike back with the same poison they gave me. All I needed was my name, and now I had it back. It didn't happen overnight. Power. When you've spent years denying it doesn't come rushing in like a waterfall. It creeps back slowly like sunlight through a crack in the door. But the moment I reclaimed my name, the shift inside me became irreversible. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the screaming, shaking way I once imagined revenge would feel. I was calm, cold, precise. Because true power doesn't shout. It moves in silence, and everyone feels it. I returned to our home 3 days later, not to stay, just to observe. I needed to see with my own eyes what I had once called love. David was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone, a takeout box half-eaten on the coffee table. The house looked stale, like something abandoned even though it was still full of life. Dishes in the sink, laundry in the corner, silence where my footsteps used to fill the hallways. He looked up and blinked. Whitney, I didn't smile. I didn't hug him. I just nodded and walked past him toward the bedroom. He followed me like a confused puppy trying to fill the silence with apologies. Look, I know things got out of hand. Evelyn's just Evelyn. She's old school. You know that. Old school. Was that supposed to excuse a slap? Years of humiliation? The subtle erasure of my self-worth. I turned to him and asked, "Did you tell her I left? She figured it out when you didn't come home. She's worried. Worried about me or about what people will say." He hesitated. That was enough. I opened the closet and began pulling out what was left of my things. I hadn't brought much into this house not because I didn't have things, but because I had tried to fit into their world. Like a puzzle piece carved down to match someone else's edges. "I'm not here to fight, David," I said calmly. "I just came for my things. You can tell your mother I won't be attending the gala." His brows furrowed. "But she said you were going to help set it up." I chuckled under my breath. "She doesn't need my help. She'll be busy finding a new venue. Hers is unavailable now." He blinked. That was the first time I saw fear in his eyes. "Whitney." "What are you saying?" I walked to the door with my suitcase and paused. "I'm saying I'm done pretending to be small so she can feel big, and so you can stay comfortable." I left without another word. Back in Connecticut, I threw myself into the life I'd buried for so long. I wasn't just reawakening an old identity, I was constructing a new future. I met with the Whitmore Holdings board and surprised them with strategic insight on their stagnant projects. I greenlit initiatives under my name. I built something not from scratch, but from the ashes of who I used to be. And slowly the world began to shift around me too. Evelyn's calls became more frequent and more desperate. First, it was about the gala. Then it was about some confusion with a building permit for her friend's boutique. Then it was a frantic voicemail about David's application for a private investment loan being inexplicably denied. I didn't respond. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. Because while they ignored me for years, the truth is Evelyn's charity, David's loan, and even their friend's boutique all depended on networks built by the Whitmore name. The name they mocked. The name they thought belonged to someone else. I began removing myself from all joint accounts. I called the bank and cut off their secondary credit cards. I instructed the housekeeper to stop showing up on Wednesdays. And when David's accountant called panicking about a recent asset freeze, I said 5 simple words. "You'll need to speak professionally." Then I hung up. That wasn't cruelty. That was a boundary. A line I should have drawn years ago but didn't because I thought love meant self-erasure. Now I knew better. Love without respect is just servitude. And I had served enough. I stopped wearing beige and cream, the colors Evelyn insisted were classy. I wore crimson, deep emerald, black silk. I stopped straightening my curls. I let them flow free like the wild thing they were like I was once. And people noticed. At a networking event in Manhattan, an investor asked if I was related to Robert Whitmore. I smiled. "I'm his daughter." "Ah," he said, extending his hand. "That explains the way you walk into a room." That night I stood in my hotel suite staring out at the skyline and whispered to my reflection, "You're back. No more shrinking. No more begging. Just presence. Command. Stillness." The phone rang again. Evelyn. I watched it light up, watched it buzz, then silenced it. She'd learn eventually. The shift wasn't just about wealth. It wasn't even about vengeance. It was about remembering who I was before I was anyone's wife, anyone's daughter-in-law, anyone's punching bag. I wasn't done yet, but the power was back in my hands, and they were finally starting to feel it. The truth, when handled carefully, can be sharper than any blade. I never intended to make a scene. That's what Evelyn would have done, loud, theatrical, dramatic. No, I wanted my truth to land differently. Quiet, unavoidable, dignified. Something that echoed in the minds of everyone who had ever dismissed me. And what better stage for that revelation than Evelyn Bennett's prized gala? Despite my absence, the Bennett Foundation went ahead with their plans, still clinging to the hope that I would come crawling back to smooth everything over like I always did. They didn't know I had already acquired the venue she had so proudly booked. They didn't know I now had veto power over every booking in that building. 2 weeks before the event, her assistant called the venue to confirm final guest lists and AV equipment. The reply? Your event has been canceled due to internal restructuring. The fallout came instantly. I watched from the sidelines as Evelyn scrambled to find a replacement location. Calls were made. Favors begged. Her reputation staked on an event that no one else wanted to host. She didn't know the reason doors were closing on her was me. She didn't know her own daughter-in-law now sat on the board of 3 of the firms she was trying to contract. She didn't know I had become the quiet shadow behind the glass curtain she used to believe only she could peek through. And then came the gala night. Despite the chaos, she managed to relocate the event to a much smaller venue. Less prestigious, less glamorous, but still salvageable if no one noticed. But people noticed. She wore red, the same shade I had worn the last time she saw me. The irony was almost poetic. David stood beside her, face-tense smile plastered on with desperation. I entered late, alone, wearing a midnight black gown and a diamond bracelet my father once gave me on my 21st birthday. Not flashy, just unmistakably not cheap. The heads turned before I even made it to the doors. And then the moment came. The MC stepped onto the stage to thank key donors and legacy patrons. A list of names followed. Then came the twist. We are especially honored tonight to welcome back to the Whitmore Foundation legacy family, Miss Whitney Whitmore Green. Silence. A sharp intake of breath. The entire ballroom turned toward me as the spotlight found my face. Evelyn's hand froze mid-sip. Her expression turned from confusion to horror. David looked like he had swallowed glass. I walked forward slowly, calmly. My heels didn't falter once. I nodded at the MC, offered a graceful thank you, and returned to my seat. That was it. I didn't need a microphone. The revelation had already shattered the illusion. Suddenly, every guest Evelyn had bragged to about saving me from poverty realized she was the charity case in this story. She had slapped the daughter of one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country, publicly. She had mocked the same woman who was now sponsoring 3 new city developments and sitting quietly at the helm of half the donors in that room. And worse, she had no idea. David was the first to approach me. "Whitney," he stammered, eyes wide, voice low. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked him dead in the eye. "I did tell you who I was. You just never cared to ask more." He opened his mouth, closed it again. I didn't know." I leaned in, my voice like glass. "That was the problem, David. You never wanted to." And then Evelyn appeared. She looked pale, truly pale, like her blood had forgotten how to flow. For the first time, she wasn't the woman who walked with her nose in the air. She was trembling, small, unsure. "Whitney," she said, her voice cracking, "I didn't know. Please believe me. I had no idea who you really were." I raised my chin. "I know you didn't, and you made no effort to find out. You were too busy deciding who I wasn't." Her mouth opened to protest, but I held up my hand. "No more apologies," I said. "This isn't about money. It never was. It's about respect, and you lost that a long time ago." Her eyes filled with tears, but mine didn't, because I had cried enough. And now, it was her turn to feel small. The whispers in the room grew louder. People who once smiled at Evelyn were now exchanging glances behind her back. Her power, her social image was crumbling beneath her expensive shoes. Not because I humiliated her, but because the truth exposed itself. And truth, when ignored for too long, becomes radioactive. I didn't stay long after that. Just long enough for everyone to see what dignity looks like, what quiet strength can do. I slipped out while they were still processing. Let them talk. Let them remember. I didn't need to shout. The truth had already done the heavy lifting. And Evelyn. She had finally learned the most painful lesson of all. You never know who someone really is until it's far too late to undo the damage. The morning after the gala, my phone lit up with a string of missed calls and voicemails. David, Evelyn, unknown numbers from their mutual friends. It was as though I had flipped a switch and suddenly I wasn't the invisible one anymore. I was important. I was urgent. But what none of them seemed to understand was this: I didn't need their attention. I needed their absence. I listened to the first voicemail. Whitney, it's David. Please, can we talk? I didn't know about your father. I didn't know anything. I was an idiot. But I love you. I always have. Please just give me a chance to explain. Explain what exactly? How he let his mother humiliate me for years. How he stood by while she slapped me, spit on my dignity, and called me names. How he let me dim myself down to fit inside their brittle little world, while he got to stay comfortable, protected, adored. Love isn't watching someone drown while you float on the surface and say, "You're strong enough." Love is pulling them out. And he never pulled me out. Evelyn's voicemail was worse. Whitney, darling. I've had time to reflect on everything. You must know I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you. It was never personal. I simply didn't understand who you were. I was wrong. And I'd like the chance to make it right. It was never personal. That was the line that made my chest tighten. All those years of condescension, cruelty, and cold disregard, and she thought a simple apology could wipe it all away. Because now suddenly I had a last name she respected. Because now she needed me. Her words weren't an apology. They were damage control, and I was done being anyone's PR solution. Still, I agreed to meet them. Not because I owed them anything, but because closure isn't for the guilty. It's for the ones who've carried the weight. We met at a private restaurant. Neutral ground. One of the places Evelyn used to scoff at, too modern, too noisy, until they featured it in Forbes' Dining Edition. Now she claimed she'd always loved it. They were already seated when I arrived. David stood the moment he saw me, his face pale and tired. "Whitney," he whispered, stepping forward. I raised a hand to stop him. "Sit!" He obeyed. Evelyn's smile trembled on her lips. She looked like she hadn't slept. I wondered if she'd spent the night rehearsing her script, or simply reeling from the realization that she no longer controlled the narrative. "I want to begin," she said softly, by saying how truly sorry I am. I looked her dead in the eye. "Are you sorry for slapping me, or for slapping the daughter of a billionaire?" She flinched. David spoke. "Whitney, that night when it happened, I was shocked. I didn't know what to do. I froze. That doesn't mean I didn't care." "No," I said calmly. "It means you were more afraid of upsetting her than standing up for me." He dropped his gaze. Evelyn reached across the table, hand trembling. "I was cruel," she said. "There's no excuse. I was threatened by how different you were. I thought you weren't good enough. I see now how wrong I was." I stared at her hand, then back into her eyes. "Do you... Please, Whitney, let us fix this." I sat back, took a breath. You know, for years I told myself if I was just a little more patient, a little more polite, a little more invisible, maybe you'd see me as family. But you never did. Not when I gave you my time. Not when I gave up my career to support your son. Not even when I threw you a retirement party that took me 3 months to plan. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know how much you did. I didn't need you to know how much I did. I needed you to respect me." David leaned forward. "Can't we start over?" "No," I said, "because I can't unknow what I know now. I can't unfeel what I felt. And you don't get to rewrite the story now that you know my name holds weight." The table went still. You see, I continued respect that's based on pedigree isn't respect at all. It's opportunism. And I'm not interested in maintaining relationships built on fear of what I can do. You didn't care when I was Whitney Green. So you don't get to keep me now that I'm Whitney Whitmore again. Evelyn's tears finally spilled. "I was wrong." "I know." David reached for my hand. "I still love you. I believe you, I said, but love without courage is cowardice. He didn't have a reply. I stood up slowly, placed a sealed envelope on the table. My lawyer will be in touch. The divorce will be civil, fair, and fast. The house is yours, the cars too. I don't want anything that belonged to that version of me, Evelyn sobbed quietly. David swallowed hard. You're really leaving, he asked. I nodded. I forgave you already, I said softly, but I won't go back to being someone small enough to fit in your lives. And with that, I walked out. Not because I was angry, but because I had finally healed. And healed women don't go back to cages no matter how many flowers you place inside. There is a particular kind of silence that follows closure. Not the kind filled with grief or regret, but the kind that feels like a freshly cleaned window after years of grime. The world looks clearer, lighter. Yours. That's how it felt the morning I stepped off the ferry onto the shores of Martha's Vineyard, the ocean breeze catching the hem of my linen coat as if to welcome me home. Not the home I once shared with David, not the estate of my father's empire, but my home bought with my own hands in my own name with no one else's permission. The cottage sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, a weathered white porch and climbing ivy tracing the windows. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It was peaceful, private, and most of all mine. I unpacked slowly. There was no rush, no one waiting on dinner, no tension in the walls. Just the hum of waves and the sound of freedom pressing softly at the windows. That first night I wrote a letter, not to David, not to Evelyn, but to myself. Dear Whitney, you were never weak. You were patient and kind and hopeful in the face of cruelty. But now you know your light does not exist to make others feel more powerful. Your silence was never your weakness. It was your armor. But you don't need it anymore. You are not someone's disappointment. You are not someone's servant. You are a woman reborn. I folded it, placed it in the drawer beside my bed, and for the first time in years, I slept without tension behind my teeth. The weeks passed quietly. David sent the signed divorce papers without contest. He didn't call again. Evelyn mailed me a handwritten letter. It was heartfelt, surprisingly so. She admitted to her jealousy, her insecurities, even her guilt about the way she raised David to see compliance as love. She ended it with a single line, "You were the daughter I never gave myself permission to deserve." I reread it twice, then set it down. I didn't feel angry anymore, just tired, grateful, relieved. Forgiveness had come not like lightning, but like a tide. Slow, inevitable, cleansing. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. I wrote her back only once. I forgive you for everything, truly. But I've outgrown that house, that life, and the role I was expected to play. I wish you peace and healing. Whitney. And that was the end of that chapter. Now I spend my days how I choose. I drink coffee on the porch as the sun rises. I host writing workshops in the garden behind my cottage. I've reconnected with the publishing world on my terms, found women like me who had once shrunk themselves for love and helped them find their voices again. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not out for revenge. I'm simply free. And in that freedom, I've found more power than I ever had sitting in those silent rooms holding my breath so other people could breathe easier. Sometimes people ask if I ever think about David, or Evelyn, or the version of me that once believed their love was worth erasing myself for. The truth, I do, but not with bitterness. I think of her, the girl I used to be, and I thank her. For surviving, for hoping, for enduring long enough to break free. She deserved more. And now I am more. I stand taller, I walk softer, I laugh louder. And if they ever see me again, if by some twist of fate Evelyn finds herself at one of my readings, or David sees me featured in a magazine, they'll see it in my eyes. Not revenge, not regret, but radiant peace. Because in the end, I didn't need to destroy them. I only needed to remember who I was before they forgot. My name is Whitney Whitmore Green. I live in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, and I no longer ask for respect. I command it.